Welcome to From Stuck to Scaled, Growth Strategies for Small and Mid-Sized Businesses, your guide to navigating growth, transformation, and success in today's ever-changing business landscape. Each week, we'll dive into proven strategies, real-world case studies, and actionable insights designed to help small and mid-sized business owners scale smart, lead stronger, and grow faster. Let's get you unstuck and on the path to sustainable, scalable success. Now your host, Julio Gonzalez.
Welcome back to From Stuck to Scaled. I'm your host, Julio Gonzalez. Business leaders often think about financial risk, market risk, or even technology risk. But one of the most overlooked and most costly areas of risk is people. From unclear decision-making to gaps in communication, these hidden cracks in your culture can quietly drain energy, stall execution, and erode trust. Today, we're diving into how to spot these issues early and turn them into strengths. My guest today is Rachel Platt, the founder of PLATTinum Consulting. Rachel is a former Chief Human Resources Officer with more than 20 years of experience leading global teams, navigating 8 M&A transactions, and helping organizations move beyond compliance into true people strategy. Today, she advises nonprofits, professional services firms, and B2B organizations across the U.S. on how to align people with mission and growth. Let's welcome Rachel to the show. Hey, Rachel, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Julio. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I am excited to have you here. I love talking about people, and that is your specialty. So tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about PLATTinum HR.
Yes, well, I spent my corporate career a little bit over 20 years, rising the ranks in human resources in every aspect, and decided in 2018 that I had reached what I thought was the pinnacle. I was the chief people officer, and I really hated it. It's what I had been aspiring to for all of these years, but I had gotten too far away from actually feeling like I was having an impact on the humans that worked in any organization. I was certainly having a big impact on the organization, but it started to feel really impersonal, and I didn't feel like I was connecting as much with the leaders and the actual employees that work there. And that's always what I had thrived and found a lot of passion in. So started PLATTinum HR Consulting, and we work with small and mid-sized companies across the country, for-profits and not-for-profits, really focused on helping organizations move beyond the day-to-day and compliance. No, we don't do HR operations. We really are focused on the systemic and sustainable initiatives that help organizations and leaders to attract, onboard, develop future leaders, assess their talent, really plan for the future, no matter what that future may be. And these days, you really have no idea which end is up sometimes. And so really partnering with those leaders to create a people strategy that is meaningful and allows both the business and the humans that work there to thrive. And I love it.
A lot of those things are often overlooked because they get lost in the day-to-day minutia.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit more about some of those people risks that can really stall a small and mid-sized business.
There's so many of them. I mean, I would say that the top 3 really are lack of clarity. That means lack of clarity in roles, in decision making. People trip over each other. Critical things get dropped because they're not clear on who's responsible for what, who gets to make the ultimate decision. And that definitely creates an environment where people are frustrated.
And according to the leader, it's always the employee's fault, right?
Oh, clearly and absolutely. But that really also leads to number two, which probably should have been number one, which is all about communication gaps. Leaders think that they have been crystal clear, but if you ask employees what the strategy is, what the priority is for the day, the week, the month, the quarter, if you ask five people and you get 10 different answers, then I'm sorry, no matter how many times or different ways that you communicated it, people may have been listening to what you said, but they didn't hear you. And so really focusing on communicating for understanding is such a huge people risk. And I guess the last one that comes to my mind is about these informal influencers, not knowing who they are or not tapping into them. And informal influencers can be employees who shape behavior, really have the ear of a lot of folks. And sometimes it's not a good thing, to be honest. They can be these culture carriers can be for good or for bad. So if you're not paying attention and deliberately planning for your culture, guess what? It's going to get made by people who may not be aligned with what the leader's vision is for the organization.
Yeah, throughout my corporate career, I always talk to, staff and peers that you don't have to be in a management role to be a leader.
Absolutely
And
not.
a lot of times you do have, like you said, those influencers that, are providing leadership both on the positive and negative side. And those negative influencers can be the most poisonous, individuals to a culture, to an initiative, to anything that's going around the organization. So let's talk about those a little bit more. When you coach your business leaders, how do you help them benefit both from the positive influencers and minimize the impact of those negative influencers?
I really spend a lot focused on how you have meaningful conversations with people, how you understand what they are experiencing, and you have all conversations from a place of curiosity. Why? Why do you think that? How could we do this differently? Those types of questions, when people feel valued, that their opinion matters, that tends to lower the temperature a little bit. If you've got someone who could be a negative influencer, it also tends to drop back the snark, if you will. So I really believe that having meaningful conversations, not just when things are going wrong, but also when things are going right, you're providing reinforcing feedback, you're providing redirecting feedback, helping people to clearly understand what is expected of them. That is a way to either temper or minimize your negative influencers and potentially even turn them to away from the dark side, if you will. And with your real culture carriers, your positive folks who are bought in and aligned with the values and the direction of the organization, those individual conversations really just magnify and help that person to feel connected and that they belong and that they are valued and that their opinion, even if you're not taking their opinion, even if you're not moving it and actioning it going forward, you listen to what they had to say. It makes such a difference. And so many leaders just, they're running so fast that they forget that their people are their ultimate growth driver.
There's a saying in Spanish that I've been using for the past many years. Mom, dress me slowly. I'm in a hurry. We just talked a little bit earlier about, us having kids. When your kids were small, you're trying to stick an arm and a leg and all this stuff. And the faster you go, the more convoluted everything is. I've been telling leaders, slow down to speed up.
Yes.
And I use that example of that saying in Spanish because you're right. Leaders are busy on 50 different things, but if
Yes.
they don't slow down to take the time to communicate effectively, to connect effectively, they can't be successful because you can't drive major change with a drive-by comment. Hey Rachel, poof, and I take off. That doesn't work.
Does not work. Even more than that, so many leaders are focused on, sales or a new product or finance or tech or funding, whatever the issue is. But they assume that if none of their people are complaining, that things are fine. And that also doesn't work because by the time the complaining happens, those cracks show up, you've already got unnecessarily high turnover. You've already got probably client issues, missed deadlines. That risk is expensive. So the investment up front saves you so much, both financially, emotionally, and from a long-term time standpoint by investing in your people up front. It seems so obvious to me, and yet it's just not a place where so many leaders just, it's not their area of focus.
And I have to ask the question, at what point do you make the decision to cut that negative Nelly? And I don't ask that loosely because, I've always worked on my people and tried to bring them on board, but at some point, you have to say enough is enough and they've got to go. So how do you drive that conversation? What is your recommendation?
I think, well, first of all, every single situation is different.
Yeah.
Let's start with that. But in general, I have coached leaders before to say to folks, look, I am willing to listen to what your concerns are as long as you come with a recommendation. I'm willing, you can send me an email. I will set up one-on-one time with you to have that conversation. But I can't allow you to try to run this place like a middle school lunchroom. That's not productive. It is, and it's not working. And that's not our culture, assuming that it is not our culture. And if you have a documented success factors, competency models, expectations of behaviors, policy, whatever format you have it written down in how you expect people to communicate, respect each other, work together, collaborate, well, then you can refer back to those things. And if someone is not in line and not willing to get on board with whatever guardrails you put in place. And that's not to say, don't misunderstand. People can have lots of different opinions. That's where innovation comes from.
Absolutely.
We're not trying to squelch innovation or free speech or any of those other things. We want that feedback, but we want it in a constructive, useful, non-distracting way. And so if somebody's not going to play by appropriate professional rules, then that's not the right organization for them or for you. And hopefully they will move on to find an environment that is better suited for their style.
You just touched on something that I talk a lot about. I do operations consulting, and I tell my clients and anybody else that listens that you have to be very practical about what you do within your business, right? Different size businesses, we're talking small to mid-size here, different size businesses require different levels of documentation, and will have different levels of maturity. So, you mentioned, you said a different word, but policy and procedure is kind of what we're talking about, and a strategy. And a lot of small, and I'll focus on small because as you get bigger, theoretically, you get more mature. A lot of small businesses say, I don't need a strategic plan. I don't need a policy. And it's like, and I tell them, I said, one page, 10 bullets, give me something, let's start building somewhere. How do you coach that to your customers about having the right levels of documentation and procedure and things like that?
So I try to be really pragmatic. Like, we do not need to boil the ocean to create policies that are for an enormous organization. But how about we just set some norms? How about we just jot down how do we want this place to run? How do we know what good looks like? How do we know what success looks like? And most of the time, sometimes it takes a little bit of convincing, but sometimes I'll just say to them, hey, here's some of the things I've heard you say. Here's some of the things we've talked about as we've had challenges with this issue or that issue. I'm going to make a draft and let's see how we do here. Let's see what we come up with. And pretty often, I'll hit a large majority of them. But even still, you do need to dig down because, what I mean by communication may not be what you mean by communication. And sure, we all say like, we're going to collaborate. Okay, but what does collaboration really look like in action? I'd like to think we all had the same definition of integrity, but I can tell you, Julio, we do not. We do not. So yeah, I mean, I work with clients. I try to get them to do it themselves. Sometimes I will, draft it out for them. And sometimes I throw in something that I know is not aligned with their values, just to get them to think about what their values actually are. And this isn't like woo-woo stuff. Like, it's not like values are all like woo-woo. This is like really pragmatic, fundamental to like, what does it take to be successful here? That's it. Let's be clear with people on what we expect, because if they're sitting around all day trying to figure out what you want from them, that is not a productive and good use of time.
Yeah, at all. And that I was going to go back to the clarity, but you ended up touching on that, because you do have to ask the individual that you are delegating to, working with, whatever the case may be, what did you hear? Maybe not in those terms, but what did you hear? What did I just ask you for?
Yeah.
To validate, that they received the message that you conveyed to them. I worked with a friend who was in Al-Anon, and one of the things that she mentioned is every time you point at somebody, there's 3 fingers pointing back, right? But going back to the earlier,
I never knew that.
Yeah. So, earlier I made the comment, it's always the employee's fault. Well, you're pointing at the employee and there's 3 fingers pointing back. So you have to validate the communication, on the procedures, on the expectations, putting them in writing is part of that validation, because everyone sees it in the same format. They still may not get it, on paper, but at least you have a better.
When you see it in black and white, it causes you to ask a different question that you hadn't asked before.
Exactly.
And I mean, this is getting back to your very first question about like, what are the overlooked people risks? It's that communication. And so making sure that we're speaking the same language, even if we're all speaking English or speaking Spanish or whatever, do we actually mean the same thing? Because particularly when you are working with a really diverse population of people that have different experiences and maybe haven't been, I mean, I work with a lot of, just to use it as an example, I work with a lot of accounting firms. It is amazing how they all use the exact same words, but those words mean slightly different things. And when I'm working with them on a merger, the number of times that I say, hello, folks, we need to do a vocabulary check. Does everybody mean the same thing when they're talking about WIP, work in progress? Do we really mean the same thing? Oh, no, we don't. Or we're talking about bonuses or whatever the case may be. We don't all mean the same thing. So you got to double check it, just like you said.
Yeah, and I am a stickler for language, and I will ask, what do you mean by whip? What do you mean by whatever?
Yes.
Because there are so many, different understandings, and having come from a technology background, IT people are pretty, strict in certain ways, and they don't understand a lot of the business terminology. So I always go back and verify language. And if you've got your accountants in a room with your technology people and sales, you're kind of tested for failure because you're doing a 3-4 way translation that's practically impossible.
It's like we need to be sitting at one of those international meetings where everyone has
The
their
headphones.
own earphones. Or did you hear it? Like it's coming on our iPhones now.
Yeah.
You can just turn it on in any language.
So we'll I'll have to email Apple and ask them to add technology to the universal translator technology and accounting.
Workplace acronyms, please. Also.
Yeah. So we've kind of danced around a little bit. Why do business leaders, besides being really busy, miss out on these risks until it's too late?
I think people think that they are much better interviewers and hirers than they actually are.
Agreed.
So often we all have certain biases that we, as we are interviewing folks, that we think, oh, we went to the same schools, we know some of the same people, we've worked in the same organizations. Oh, they did this that was very, very impressive at that very impressive organization. They're going to be just fine. And the reality is we need to spend more time, again, going back to your go slow to go fast, we need to spend more time focused on what success looks like before we actually post a job so that we know what questions to ask when we are interviewing and so that we are properly onboarding people. And we need to check in on them. So frequently, folks that have been with an organization for between 90 days and like up to a year, like they're out of that truly newbie phase. And they often say that they feel really ignored, that they're doing the best that they can. And they think that they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
But they're not necessarily getting enough formal or informal feedback. So leaders at any level, whether they're, the executive team or just your direct supervisor, they're not getting enough attention to know that they're on track. they're not getting enough feedback to know, hey, that's not how we do it here, but explain to me why you did it that way, because maybe we should be doing it that way here. And people just they miss it, because back to the whole, if nobody's actively complaining, then everything must be fine. And yeah, we just need to do a much better job in how we interview, onboard, and give feedback.
So why not just do a 10 level interview to make sure you're covering all aspects, and you're getting a wide variety of people talking to that person. And I'm being
I mean,
sarcastic here.
would you want to do that? I am pretty sure the answer is no. But
Been there, done that.
yeah, yes, got the t-shirt and never want to go back. Look, the reality is, if you plan ahead and create your interview team and think about it in a structured way, that is not a jail cell. You can only ask these questions, but just in a structured way where you say, hey, we're going to have 4 people who are going to be on our interviewing team. Julio, you please cover topics like trend, gathering trends, data, staying on top of what's happening in the marketplace. And also, why don't you talk to them about their management philosophy for people management? And Sally over here, you're going to talk to them about how they have handled very specific instances that are extremely relevant to this job. And, Steve, you're going to talk about how they handle financial issues, and whatever the matter is, but you're creating a level of consistency so that you can, whether it is a formal rubric or a rubric in your brains, but that you can compare candidates, that you can ensure that you're giving a good employee or candidate experience, because otherwise you're all asking the same questions and it's fly by the seat of your pants and it looks pretty darn disorganized. And if it's taking you 10 people to make a hire, you don't know what you're doing. You need a new plan, because again, that's also not a good use of your management team's time.
Yeah, it's terrible. My specific experience was literally 6 levels of interviews on one day.
Oh,
And then they brought me back, and I don't remember what wording they used, but they literally sent an email to my entire staff. I ended up taking the job. They sent an email to my entire staff and said, we're interviewing your new boss at 2:00. Whoever can be in the room, whoever can be on camera, join in. And literally it was a group of, like, I think 8 people showed up or something like that. And I'm sitting there and it's like, what the heck is this? And I
yeah.
should have taken all the signs to not take the job.
I was going to ask, which red flag was where it's not waving?
And one of the earlier rounds was with a third party, person like yourself that did a disc assessment and all kinds of stuff, and it was just red flag after red flag, and I didn't.
I mean, there are ways to do interviews that include assessments, and there are ways to do interviews that could include a select few of your potential direct reports. But that also should be for you to get to know them,
Right.
not just for them to get to know you. But if, like, that sounds like fly by the seat of your pants, and yeah, sorry about that. I would have not advised that.
Yeah, the individual didn't quite. She wasn't a good HR person. Let me put it to you that way. In every form, but it is what it is. What about, since we're talking about interviewing, what about promotions? How do you coach your customers on promotions, internal mobility? Because that's always a challenge. Do I give this person an opportunity? What about fairness? And so there's a lot that goes into that. So how do you approach that with your customers?
I would say with my clients, I really try to think about, again, and it does not need to be formal. I really do try to get them thinking about succession planning at all levels and regardless the size of the organization, and get really focused on what would it take for this person to move to the next level. What resources do we have in place to help this person to get ready? How can we set goals with them to help them to acquire the skills, have different experiences, maybe shadow someone else? Um, how do we get creative, particularly when you don't have a huge budget, in growing your team? And so there's lots of creative and low cost, relatively low cost ways to do that. I mean, hiring from within is one of your best ways to build certainly longevity within the organization, but also loyalty to the organization. And there's just not as much ramp up, all of those things. So if you can hire internally, even if it is someone who it's going to be a big step for, if you can do it, there are so many positives that typically outweigh uh, um, any negative that could come from it. That's not to say that hiring from the outside is not an incredible boost to your talent base, to your capacity, all of those things. But really understanding, and back to a competency model or a success model, to be able to say, well, here's what we expect to see from someone at the associate level, and here's what we expect to see from somebody at the senior associate or the manager level, or whatever your hierarchy actually is. All of those, that investment in someone, um, really can benefit your entire organization, whether they get the job or not. Ultimately, you put them in the job or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of, I won't even say small to mid-sized, but a lot of businesses don't really understand when to promote from within, when to bring in somebody from within the same industry, and when to diversify and bring in from outside the
Yeah.
industry. I worked for a transportation and logistics company, and honestly, they did a fantastic job of finding, it wasn't always the best, but finding the best uh, resources for the job, regardless of where they came from. We
Mhm.
had a chief human resources officer that came from Pepsi. We had a CFO that came from GE. Completely outside of that transportation and logistics, and that I think brought a lot of value, to that leadership team and
Yes.
to the direction of the organization versus what I found when I went into healthcare. Everybody in healthcare has worked with everybody in healthcare in at least three other companies. Now, and I get it, healthcare is tough. You need to really understand the space. But at what point are you going to bring in a retail expert because you're doing, healthcare retail? Uh,
Right.
and that in the health, I think that's probably like one of the single most um, important issues that healthcare faces because they don't have that external influence. So it's just more and more of the same. So how do you guide your customers in maybe making some of those decisions?
It's a balance. We spend a lot of time talking about, okay, how are we going to scale? what is it going to take? What new ways of thinking do we need? And we try to be very deliberate about where and how hires are made, and be strategic about how we are thinking about this hire versus that hire right now at this moment in time versus what this may look like 18 months from now. What are the biggest priorities, and how do we align this role with whatever our plan is for a period of time? I mean, you want to be hiring for the long term, but sometimes your most immediate priorities need to take priority, if you will. And that's okay if you do it intentionally. But if you're just like plucking from the sky, oh, here's a person that they'll be great. I mean, I worked with a not-for-profit organization that had a need, and they are in build mode. And they interviewed a whole bunch of folks who are incredible at maintaining. They are incredible. They are thoughtful. They're great at improving. They are good leaders. And that's not what the business needed right now. And the more we talked about it, the discussion really was, well, the build phase is only going to be, let's call it 2.5 years. Okay, we'll either hire someone with the expectation that they may be bored, you may be bored, there may be other opportunities within the organization, or maybe they're going to move on. Or if it's a shorter term than that, consider an interim hire, consider a consultant. There's lots of different solutions, but you actually have to know what your problem is that you're trying to solve for.
And what I hear, kind of underlying all of our entire conversation is definitely, on this area, that leader needs sufficient self-awareness to be able to be successful in communicating, in leading, in setting a strategy, in hiring. How do you help that leader build that self-awareness?
Let's actually add to your list. In delegating.
Yes.
In getting the heck out of the way if they hire, having enough or not too much ego that they don't know everything. That this happens very often with founders or other leaders who they think that they need to be in the middle of everything. So again, let's go back to hire slowly, take your time, not to make it a long drawn out 14-person process, but to spend the time up front to think about, have you thought about your own style? Have you thought about what decision making? I mean, I use a RACI or a DACI model. I'm not sure if you're familiar or if your listeners are, who is responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who is informed. Thank you. And really sitting down sometimes with the leader to say, this new hire, let's come up with the things on these 6 priorities that you have for them. Where do they sit? Where do you sit? Let's not just keep this to ourselves. Let's share this so that, again, everybody knows where we're coming from. And I've worked with, particularly in the M&A space, when organizations do that, it just it makes things go so much smoother. Even if you have to fix it or change it down the road, we have something to refer to,
right?
Something to start from, And we can hold each other accountable with a smile, not with bad feelings or just frustration. Just, hey, I thought this was mine. You keep coming in on this. Do we need to rethink that? Because if I just know that this is going to be yours and you don't want to give this to me, I got other things to work on.
What a conflict.
I mean, that's how I really try to coach and work with my leaders. Pragmatic, thoughtful, but not long drawn out. It doesn't need, we don't need process for process sake.
Yeah.
We just need to be intentional, organized, and when it needs a process, let's put one in place and communicate it. And let's move on.
So, Rachel, as you know, no one leaves the show without providing some actionable tips that our listeners can implement today to improve their business. So what do you have for our listeners?
So I'm going to go a little bit off of what we talked about, just something different. The first thing that I would suggest to you is find someone today to tell them that they're doing a great job and to thank them and to be very specific about what you have observed them doing and why it matters and why it makes a difference. A little bit of gratitude and appreciation goes really, really far. And not enough of us do it on a regular enough basis. And we think, oh, they know. Particularly, my stars know how much I appreciate them and how much I care about them. Yeah, they probably do, and do it anyway. Write them a handwritten note or just stop them in the hallway or get on a Zoom with no agenda other than to tell them thank you. But if you do schedule that agenda, tell them up front.
What it is. Because otherwise I'm getting fired.
Yes. So that's number one. Number two best advice is to write down the things that if you won the lottery or got hit by a bus or some other thing happened, that you would want your next person to know. I was dealing with this recently with a medical issue that came up. And, sometimes it's as simple as passwords. And I'm not talking about in your family situation. Of course, you should do that also. But at work, sometimes, like, if you're really working on something, particularly something that may be new and still in the formative stages, but could have a real impact on your business, positive or negative, even if it's a secret or confidential, you got to share it with somebody, because there's an organization right now, there's probably many of them, but there's one that I'm working with that is really, really in some dire straits because they didn't have a good plan. And luckily this person will be fine, but not soon enough for the situation. And I would say that the last one is, don't take yourself so seriously. Like, work really hard, do good, put good out into the world. And unless you're actually a doctor saving people's lives, just keep an even head about yourself that, like, yes, this is important. Yes, this is hopefully has a purpose and a why and is going to put good out into the world. But, don't forget to miss out on your life or to not miss out on your life, and let your employees and your team do that as well.
And Rachel, where can our listeners find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, where I am often chatting about leadership, the future of work, people strategy. So that's Rachel Platt. Platt is spelled with 2 T's. So is platinum. And my website is platinumconsulting.com, also with the 2 T's in platinum. And I would love to chat with any of your listeners about how we can improve their people strategy and ensure that their leaders are happy and their employees are thriving and you're more profitable and going to work does not suck.
And it doesn't have to. So
It doesn't have to.
they just need to listen. A big thank you to Rachel Platt for sharing her valuable expertise and reminding us that people are our greatest assets and that need real attention. Thanks for tuning in to From Stuck to Scaled. Remember, most risks to your business aren't on the balance sheet. They're in your people. By spotting these issues early, you can protect. By spotting these issues early, you can protect your culture and accelerate growth. If you found today's conversation valuable, share this episode with another business leader who's focused on building stronger teams. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss future growth strategies. See you next week.
You've been listening to From Stuck to Scaled, growth strategies for small and mid-sized businesses, produced by Optocution LLC. For more information, tools, and resources, check out our website www.redefinepossible.co/podcast.